You're listening to WCOM LP 103.5 FM Carborough and Chapel Hill. It's a Tuesday, it's 5 o'clock, and that only means one thing. It's time for another round of Snarky Faith with your host, Stuart Deloney. This is a space where we irreverently wrestle through life, culture, and spirituality, all with our heads in the clouds, our tongues in our cheeks, our hearts in our sleeves, and our feet on the ground. At Snarky Faith, the questions or even the answers are never the point. It's all about the conversation. So here's your host, Stuart Deloney.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to another round of Snarky Faith. I'm your host, Stuart Deloney, and Snarky Faith is radio for the spiritually disenfranchised. If you've had enough of the insanity in Christianity, you've come to the right place. Here at Snarky Faith, we're all about finding a sane faith grounded in reality and working to make the world a better place in tangible ways. This is not a zone for spiritual escapism, Sunday school answers, or Christianese. We're here to call out religious BS and look for better ways forward. And if you can handle your conversations about faith with copious amounts of
sarcasm
and also a little bit of this, then you've come to the right place. Welcome home. On today's show, I'm going to be sitting down with author Melissa Florer-Bixler and her new book, How to Have an Enemy. Before we enter into the snark, just a reminder that this broadcast and all past podcasts can be found at www.snarkyfaith.com and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Amazon, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, YouTube. We're here, we're there, we're everywhere. Just look for Snarky Faith. And if you're looking to interact more with the show, you can find the Snarky Faith page on Facebook. You can drop me a line at questions@snarkyfaith.com. And there's even the Snarky hotline if you want to leave a message. That number is 919-525-1570. That's 919-515-1570. Well, I hope everyone's week is going by swimmingly and you are doing well. I myself am finding I'm halfway through the summer. It's not too bad where we're at. 90s aren't quite 130 like what happened in Death Valley or in the Pacific Northwest last week. Yeah, so I shouldn't be complaining. And plus, we got Ted Lasso coming out in a couple weeks. Week or two. If you don't know who Ted Lasso is, you should. It's exactly what you need right now. Or 6 months ago is what you needed to, but you still need it now. Yeah. So kicking off the show, I wanted to talk about two different surveys that were out recently. There was this was a Pew poll that was examining the 2020 electorate based on validated voters. And in the category of did we not learn anything? Spoiler, we did not. And when I say we, I do not mean me. I speak of white evangelicals, of which I was years ago. But here is what some of the findings show us. That Trump's strong support amongst white evangelical Protestants in 2016, 77% voted for him. What about 2020? Did we learn anything? Did we learn anything, evangelicals? Well, we did learn that they wanted more. They saw what they had the first time, and then they were like, you know what? It was so terrible, I want a double dose of that, because 84% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2020. While, which I love they throw in this here, while Biden got more support amongst atheists and agnostics than did Clinton in 2016. What do we hear about that? So hold these up, right? Hold these in your head. So this one survey, we see the upswing for white evangelicals, loving Trump. We also see Biden getting a lot of support from atheists and agnostics. Okay, so they're going to hop over to this. Now, this is the PP. No, it's not the PP. It's the PRRI, the Public Religion Institute. So they had also done a survey and looking at trends within religion in America. Who's been trending up? Who's trending down? What's happening? And I'm not going to say these two necessarily are connected in nature, but I do think they are. I mean, you can't completely prove this, but I do think they are. Because the PRRI found this over at Roll to Disbelieve over on Pathos. And I'm going to go ahead and quote from the article to summarize what the PRRI, I won't make that mistake again, what the PRRI had to say. There really isn't much good news in this survey for white evangelicals. Not only do their numbers continue to decline over the past decade, but now their hated, derived enemies, the white mainline Christians, outnumber them now. That's right. That's right. Because it seems like to me on paper, the more they love Trump, the less palatable they become to people. And people just leave church because they can't see Jesus anymore. That checks out. That checks out. So, like, does the greeting card industry have, like, a card for an occasion like this? Like, sorry that your hatred has driven your flock away. Flip the page. Maybe it's because you hate people that are gay. Spitballing here. So, Hallmark, call me, because maybe we could make up something. It always warms the heart to see a hate group decline in numbers. I don't know about you, but it does mine. It warms my heart every time. And speaking about crazies of the faith, we also have here on the show, if you're new to the show today, listening, our weekly segment where we farm the best of the worst, the choicest cuts of Christian nuts, the worst parts of Christianity, and we mine all of their insanity. So, without further ado, let's hop in for the Christian crazy of the week.
If loving the Lord is wrong, I don't want to be right.
Lord have mercy. The Lord is my shepherd. He know what I want.
Well, you can't get crazy without Hank Kunneman. He is literally the king of Christian bullshit. I mean, if there was a prize, if there was a crown, a bullshit crown made of literal bullshit, it would be suiting, because that is high praise for Hank Kunneman and his ability to spin yarns, to prophesy, get it wrong, but blame everyone else. Oof, it's got to be fun being married to that guy. So here, and I remind you, Hank is preaching this in his church. Now, I know prophets get a certain amount of space to kind of, I don't know, like, what are they, like jazz? They can kind of go off the book and just kind of play it by feel, but call me crazy. I don't see how this really fits into church service on a Sunday morning, but here we go.
Psalm 72, verse 14 declares that God is the God that redeems us from oppression, fraud, and violence. This will begin to take place.
Whoa there, big guy. Let's just pump the brakes real quick. Let's actually do a little bit of, biblical reading and not move just beyond that. One, Scripture doesn't exactly say that. It doesn't exactly capture what he's saying. He's quoting Psalm 72, 14, where it says, he will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight. Now, what we should do is take a few steps back in what's happening in these verses here. Let's start in 12. For he will deliver the needy who cry out, the afflicted who have no one to help. He will take pity on the weak and the needy and save the needy from death. He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight. Now, what does this say? What does this say for people that are butthurt because they lost an election and still can't give it up? What is that? It doesn't say that at all. Oh, well, what about for people that are into just lovers of Christian nationalism and everything belonging to the fat orange Messiah? No, that really doesn't apply to any of them at all either. It has to do with the weak and the marginalized and those that God tends to side himself with. So Hank is taking this completely out of context. Now, we're not here to try to parse out how Hank reads Scripture, because we already know it's terrible. I just needed to get that part off my chest because it really made no sense what he was going after for Scripture. But, in these circles, Scripture, schmicture, it doesn't matter. he just uses that as a hopping off point, right? So remember this. I'll bring it back just a bit so you can remember what he was trying to say and see where he goes with it. And you have to ask yourself, how's he going to make this about Trump? Because you know he's going to do it. You know he's going to do it. So here we go. Let me rewind it a bit and let you listen to it again.
Psalm 72, verse 14 declares that God is the God that redeems us from oppression, fraud, and violence. This will begin to take place. The other thing that God has been specifically speaking, this is the 245th year of America's reign. And I believe it represents 2 more terms for 45, or 2 terms for 45.
Woo! 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 There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is how it's done. That is why he's the king. Did any of those 2 connect together whatsoever? No, not at all. Just saying that 2 and 45 and how old our country is, that means 2 for 4. What? This is so stupid. It's so asinine, but guess what? Nobody does it better. Oof, no more singing for starting the show. Yeah. So next up, now, I've shown you some of the best. And not everyone can be quite as good of the spiritual gift of BS, but Hank was blessed with it. He was touched with it. Or you can just say he's just touched. Well, next up, we have Dutch sheets. Dutch sheets, it's kind of like, is this Egyptian cotton? No, they're just Dutch sheets. Dutch sheets is going to talk about some miraculous things that have happened during COVID. But you also need to note here, he's going to tell some amazing tales of what's happened, but also tell you why exactly that we can't prove any of this or interview anybody about this or have any eyewitnesses about any of this just because. So yeah, this is technique number 2 today. If you can't quite spin a yarn that well, just say, it's because I can't tell you.
And it's God's timing, and he's now bringing this anointing, and signs and wonders are going to start following this quickly. I know of 3 situations personally of people that were raised from the dead by a doctor during COVID. One of those people went into the room after the person died with COVID. One of those people, the death certificate had already been signed. And this person was raised from the dead. Now, they can't talk about this because they could get in trouble, believe it or not, for doing this and for, talking about it. But I'm just saying this is beginning to happen, and we're just getting started.
Oh, you have no idea what's going to happen. There's going to be like signs and like wonders. Like what kind of signs and wonders? Oh, they're going to be huge. They're going to be big. And we're just like getting started. And well, when are we going to get started? Oh, like it's happening now. You can't see it, but it's going to be great. You're going to get everything you wanted to. This is going to be like Santa Claus, like 2.0. It's amazing. Hey, everyone, look over there. There's a bird. That's some bread and butter charlatan work there for you. It's pretty standard. It's like kind of one-on-one charlatan work, but it's a good solid move. It's a good solid move there by Dutch sheets. Not quite Hank Kuhneman level, but if you can't get to the heights, of where Hank is at, what you can do something that it's something that is, I would say it's kind of a Christian tradition. Some may say it is kind of a spiritual practice. But this is really the art of guilting people. Like if you can't win them over, if you can't convince them, you might as well just make them feel like absolute trash. I mean, Christians have perfected this move. And it may not be as showy as a Hank Kuhneman, but Perry Stone can bring it. That's right. Crazy-ass Perry Stone can totally bring it like he's going to do here. Now, this is classic, and it's beautiful. And by beautiful, I mean it's horrible. It's horrible and disgusting.
If you were called to do something, maybe you were called to help a church or a ministry, a fellowship, and that was the call where God placed you. but somehow out of offense or what you heard or what somebody said or someone's opinion, you just decided, I'm out of here, and you left. What if you were supposed to be the person to greet that young person or even pray for them in an altar and see them deliver from suicide, and you're not there, and that person commits suicide because you were assigned to be the person to reach them? This is a very, very serious thing, and I really feel like the Holy Spirit gave me a warning for Christians to please be at the position He's called you. Be the soldier He's called you. Be the person at the intercession, in the trench lines of intercession that He's called you to be. Because otherwise, somebody else will take your crown, and you will not have anything to lay before the feet of Jesus when we bow and take our crowns off to worship Him.
See, this here is really sick and twisted Christian kinky fuckery that's going on. It's the whole thing, and I've heard this preached in different iterations over the years, the idea that the blood is on your hands. If you don't do this, and then this happens, the blood is on your hands. If you weren't there holding a door for someone to walk in, they could have accidentally stepped on a crack and broken their mother's back. It's awful. And then God's going to take your crown away because God in our situation here is very small and tiny. And yes, this is sick shit. This is not the heart of Jesus. It's antithetical to the gospel. And it's pathetic. It's not pathetic that it works on people because people want to believe they're pastors and faith leaders. But it is pathetic that faith leaders use this kind of argument or stream of logic to be able to control and manipulate people, because that's what church is about, right? Come on, haven't we learned anything? Church is simply about controlling and manipulating people in order to either be able to get some sort of power or money or prestige. Wait, what? No, that's wrong. That's completely wrong. I mean, that's the inverse of how it's supposed to be. Oh, right. Because that's why we're being snarky and sarcastic during the Christian crazy, because this is the example of what Christianity should not be. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that and advocacy when I sit down with our interview that's going to happen right now. So today we are talking with Melissa Florer-Bixler. Melissa is the pastor of Raleigh Mennonite Church. She's a graduate of Duke University and Princeton Theological Seminary. She spent time studying in Israel, Palestine, Kenya, and England, and much of her formation took place in the L'Arche community in Portland, Oregon. She's the author of the new book, How to Have an Enemy, Righteous Anger and the Work of Peace, that is out on July 20th this month. So Melissa, welcome to the show.
Great. It's great to be here with you, Stuart. Thanks for having me on.
So first of all, I do have to disclose that I really enjoyed the book. And what I will say is it's challenging in a way that doesn't let you back down. You give personal historical stories of the oppressed and oppressors with like theological backing for this call to action. And I feel like it's fire, it's necessary, and I loved it. So first of all, I love the book.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, so before we hop into the book, I want to talk a little bit about the person behind the book. Because you touch on this in the book a little bit, saying that you started out life as a kid in the conservative Episcopalian church. So how did you go from there to where you are now? In the Mennonite church, you're an advocate and a voice for change. So give us like a little, what's a snapshot of Melissa?
I grew up in the conservative end of the Episcopal Church. You may know it as the Anglican Church in North America, ACANA. That didn't exist when I was a kid, but emerged sort of after I had grown up a little bit. And so I started off in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., in a deeply militarized town. Lockheed Martin is one of the major employers in Manassas, Virginia. So very much this sort of like a very strong sense of national identity, of national identity linked to imperial identity, and churches in that area, at least the churches that I attended, deeply interwoven between Christianity and that sort of nationalist imperialist identity. And so that was just, that's what you knew. Like when you're a kid, you grow up and that's the church you have and that's the church you know. And we are marking the death of Donald Rumsfeld this week, which is, so it's interesting to be having this conversation with you because it was really the Iraq War that radicalized me about Jesus and it started sort of opening up some questions for me about places I could see I needed to start to begin to pull apart my identity as a Christian from this identity as an American, which for me had always been sort of one and two go together. So I knew that something was amiss during the Iraq War, as Abu Ghraib, as these scandals around the abuse of detainees was happening. And so just around that time, I found my way into the Mennonite Church, which became a place of just a very different sort of understanding of what it means to be a Christian, and also of what it means to be an American. And so that really began some shifts for me over time, and the place that sort of became my church home. And so this book is sort of a emanation of maybe a culmination of many years in the Anabaptist tradition.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was kind of your inciting incident? What led you to say, I need to write this book now? Was there something that just kicked it off that you needed to hop in and do this now? Because it is very applicable to now.
Yeah, I think that I'm not alone in the group of people who are writing in the post-Trump administration in a ways that I think for a lot of us are actually trying to unwind the trauma of these past 5 years, from the campaign all the way to just this past January. And a lot of people in my world and my circle and activism and organizing, I think this is sort of this postmortem is happening. I don't think there's any sort of misunderstanding about how we got to this place, but the question is what did this really reveal about us, about the church, about whiteness? And so I wanted to write this book because I think in my circles, pacifist circles, people who are very committed to nonviolent peacemaking, one of the phrases from the Bible that gets lifted up all the time is love your enemy. Mm-hmm. I believe that. I think that's one of at the heart of Christian teaching. And it is a phrase that is weaponized against people who are the victims of enemies. And so, and I mean, even to the point where, I don't know if you've heard this before, but that we shouldn't have enemies, or, to love your enemies means we don't have them, which just is sort of a weird anti-logic in some ways. If Jesus says we're to love our enemies, then we have to have enemies and we have to know who they are. And I think I sort of sense that this past 4 years of the Trump administration, instead of seeing the church, that the majority white church really step into this place of resistance, what actually happened was, in a lot of ways, what felt like this gaslighting. The real problem are the divisive people, right? The real problem are the people who won't who refuse to sort of take up the gospel of unity, who can't understand their enemy and see that we all really want the same things at the end of the day. And for those of us who were helping to support people who lived in sanctuary, my church, one of our church members was in ICE detention. We bailed people out of ICE detention. I mean, we're hearing this, and at the same time, we're watching the lives of people we love just torn apart, like this wound in our community. And so I needed this sort of project to kind of put together for myself. What do I do about this message that I'm hearing about unity and togetherness and empathy and compassion, with these real experiences of devastation in my community and in our country, in our world.
Now, in the book, in talking about different enemies, you also talk a lot about this whole mentality of us and them. this kind of tribalized thinking that we get into. So what are some of the costs of being stuck in that us and them mentality?
Right. I think the danger of a sort of us and them is it begins to isolate us from the ways that we are, that enmity actually lives within each of us, right? This is that there's always work for us to be done in the liberation from all of these various oppressions that work together, that reinforce one another. So to carve out the sort of space of a clean, pure, us that sort of looks out on a them, I think does try to sort of position us off. I do, though, feel some caution against how, when I hear people sort of say that that there's a problem in that binary, what it often means is that you just don't want to talk about oppression at all, right? You're just like, oh, I think the other option can be that everything gets reduced to the personal. Well, you're such a good guy, and my neighbor cop is such a great guy. He would never want to hurt anybody. He got into policing because he loves our community and loves our neighbors. And it's well, I guess we're all just these personal stories, and that's what we're stuck with. And I think what helps us move beyond that is attention to the way that power works is always below the surface of those stories. Whose story gets normalized in our communities? Who gets to be heard? Who are policies made around? Which of those stories of empathy and compassion rise to the surface, and which are pushed down, rejected, are rationalized away in some other way? All of that is a result of power at work in our communities. And so that's really what I think offers us a way out of the sort of us them without the sort of neoliberal turn to just reducing everything to the personal.
Now, I want you to unpack this a little bit too, because this is one of your quotes from the book, and I really appreciate this, and I feel like it fits into what you're starting to talk about here. But you say that to have enemies as a source of liberation for ourselves, for those who do harm, is to recognize structures of power and their relationship to identity. Now, I want you to unpack that a little bit. How has our identity ended up being connected into systems of power?
Well, identities are constructs, right? I think this is something that I think was important to talk about throughout this book. That we make these assumptions, we build political alliances, we gather ourselves around particular ideologies, policies on the basis of our identity. In this actually, really, we do that because our identities are actually very fragile, right? We need it doesn't take much to sort of say oh wow, something about my whatever these expectations about my gender don't actually fit me. But I have to I have to recapitulate them. I have to reiterate them in order to sort of sustain my place in heteronormative order. Or in the same with whiteness, right? I have to sustain this this fictive self. And so all of that, our identities are also informed around within systems of power. And I think once we begin to the sort of willingness to talk about that, to open the door to that, there's actually freedom because having to live under the restrictions of a particular form of identity that has been passed down to you to solidify power for 2% of our country, that's bad for all of us, right? That is how the system, that is how oppressed and oppressor become the system that continues to be interlocked. And so really moving away from having enemies is also tied up in that sort of willingness to pay attention to our own identities.
And in that same vein, because I feel like what you do a lot in the book is trying to reframe certain ideas that we have, or certain assumptions that we have. So I want you to talk about a little bit of these. So I'm going to hit a few of these topics. So the first one of being prayer. I know you talk about its ability to change perspective and to reveal things about ourselves. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I wrote a chapter about these Psalms that I don't actually know if everybody knows about them, because they mostly get sort of pushed to the side of Christian prayer life, because they are Psalms about people longing for justice and being really honest with God about what these people want God to do on their behalf. And it can be pretty intense because these enmities are real. They are very real. And so what I appreciate about those is that those Psalms actually remind us that there's not really fooling God, even as we attempt to fool ourselves about the things that we actually want. And so what does it mean to actually open yourselves up and to say, like, this is actually the thing that I want, and that I think returns us to something about ourselves, right? That reveals something about who we are. And I think sometimes that reveals something that needs to be changed. But I don't want to get too stuck in that narrative, because I also think that we might also realize in that there's something very just and holy about our anger. And I think that's also been a place that the church has not really made enough space, is how do we be angry in the way that angry about the things that God is angry about?
So speaking on anger, because that was my next question as well too. So how can anger be? Because we're always told it's bad, it's bad. And so how can anger in these contexts be helpful and holy?
I think that there's an interesting sort of subset that anger is irrational, right? It doesn't fit into what amounts to a white European logical system of displaying our concerns in a civilized way, as if nothing is really on the line, right? Like that there's this, we can step away from our emotions and have this rational dialogue. And really, I think the only way that is actually the case is if you don't really have anything on the line, right? If your lives, the lives of your children, the lives of your people are invested in this conversation, asking you to put your emotional content in a space that doesn't actually impact the way that we're talking, is I would say is part of this colonial project of tribalism, right? To make anything that is outside of Enlightenment rationalism dark and African, or something that needs to be tamed, something that needs to be subjected to the will of the rational, enlightened people. And so, I think that we are already trained, as you're saying, to be suspicious of anger. Except, of course, that even that is racialized, right? Like we're watching the downplay of sort of white rage identity politics of January 6th. And Black Lives Matter is an unacceptable form of public anger. So even here, we recognize that anger is something that we find publicly acceptable when along racial terms, along gender terms, along class terms.
And so we're talking about that as anger, as how it's in us, but also how is anger useful within the confines of a community? Because you also talk about this idea of communities of shared anger.
Yeah, there's just some incredible historic examples. I talk about several of them in the book, of communities that have really formed around the ability to share anger with one another, and letting that anger turn into be fuel for them, fuel for justice, fuel for solidarity, refusing, I think, to, and this wonderful quote from Willie Jennings, which I don't have in front of me, so I'll just give you the general gist of it, but the refusal to stand off from someone's anger and say, like, I could never understand what it's like to be you, right? Like, I could never understand. And for Jennings, that's like a cop-out for him. He wants to invite white people to share in Black anger, to not have to bear that burden alone. And Dr. Jennings, my former professor, someone who's been deeply influential for me. And so I've taken that seriously. I want to participate in sharing the burden of Black anger in a way that propels us into a community of shared concern.
And along those same lines too, what is the value of truth telling in community? Because I feel like that's also connected to anger, because anger is part of it, just being able to share it, is being honest about where we're at. And then there's also a secondary power to truth telling. What is that power?
Yeah, to be angry at another person actually takes some intimacy, right? I don't know that there are, I should say, to be able to be angry at another person and for that anger to be a catalyst for something. I think people can be angry at people all the time, right? But for it to be a catalyst into something, to a deeper relationship, to a shared understanding of what is at the heart of that anger, that actually takes a community that sustains itself over time, that trusts one another, that isn't afraid of anger as not just as a destructive force, but as a force that gives life. And so my hope is that churches like mine, majority white churches, can be places that can better cultivate anger about the things that God is angry about. And that we can also hold in check when our anger is actually grief over the loss of something, of a history that we never had a right to in the first place.
That's beautiful. I like that. And another thing that you work on here, and I feel like this is, it's connected well into community, is trying to reframe this idea of family. And what is kind of our Americanized version of the nuclear family, versus this other concept that you speak about called like La Familia de Dios. So can you compare and contrast a little of those for me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the myths of family that's handed down to us, and Karl Marx was so excellent at naming this, and I think any of us who are parents and also work or care for family members beside, we know this implicitly, that family is a creation. Nuclear family is a creation to help us to be better workers, right? We've carved out this space called family that sustains us and cares for us and loves us, that we retreat to at the end of this, so that we can do this mindless work day in and day out. At least we have the family there as the sustaining purpose. And so when we begin to talk about when feminists start to talk about how the personal is always political, right? That there's actually we've been taught that you can sort of pull these things apart, but you can actually. It's very easy to see the fissure start to develop between this bifurcation, and instead. What we often see this doing is this sort of family first political ideology, right? Like, it doesn't matter if my uncle is racist. At the end of the day, he's still family, right? There's this, my kinship ties, which are also racial ties, are actually more significant than any of these other relationships. The family is up here, like family, God, country, this sort of dynamic. I actually don't know if that's right. I don't know what people say. God, family, country, something like that.
Guns are in there too somehow. If it's America,
guns are in there too.
I don't know if it's America.
I don't know. But within this sort of schema where family takes this place, like in the same place as national identity and religious identity, it means that everybody else is secondary to that. And so when we read someone like Maria Asasi talk about the expansion of family, how La Familia means that we have a kinship to people in ICE detention that is at the same level of commitment as to our racist uncle, right? Like that changes the perspective of who you are bound to, who are you bonded to, and when you are bonded, what is your responsibility? What does it mean for you in relation, both not even in the sense of like you have to do these things, but that this person's identity also speaks back into who you are, right? You are connected to them in some way, and that shift, I think, is profoundly destabilizing of the economic systems that we have been normalized and have been and that require the nuclear family in order to be sustained. Which is why, again, I think that why the conservative church, the religious right, this is why we get this family first, focus on the family, right? This is actually about economic and political power. It isn't just about moms and dads and 2.5 children or whatever it is now, right? Like we're actually talking about economics, and it's very important that we recognize the way that power works in that structure.
Now, this is slightly off the topic of the book, but still very connected into this idea of community. You and I were talking before the interview started about you being a pastor during the pandemic. So I'm just curious too. What did your community? How did they teach you during this unique time in human history? So how did they? Yeah, what did they teach you?
I was just amazed, which shouldn't be this way because Anabaptists have a strong priesthood of all believers. And so I shouldn't be as surprised about the unnecessity of myself within my church. But I just was reminded of that a little bit more. So I was doing a front porch visit with one of the oldest members of our community in her 80s. And she was telling me just sort of casually about how 3 different people from the church had come to either visit or like raise up her table a few inches or put in some, or had noticed that these drawers were at the store. And so they just decided to drop in because they knew it would make things easier for her, or had this art book they thought she would enjoy. This wasn't a program. It wasn't like, let's all sign up to help Judy out. Like, this is just what the nature of people who care for one another do. This is what it means to be invested in one another's lives, is you look out for each other. And you don't need to be reminded of that. And the fact that members of our church were able to do this in the midst of just this profound suffering and uncertainty of this past year, I think just changed me and sort of my perception of what it means for us to be whole together, even under some pretty extreme circumstances.
I love hearing that because often on the show I don't shy away from taking swipes pretty hard at American Christian Church, and during the pandemic, one of the things that I thought, if the church had generally been doing its job well, this should have just been like, hey, everything we've been talking about, guys, go do it. As opposed to everyone like, how do we live stream? How do we get all of the lighting and the music? How's all this? And but it showed how selfish in many arenas the church has just become. It was just about like, how do we do this? And the power of the gospel should have just simply been, you guys have heard us preach this. You've read the stories. Go do it now. And that would have been my hope so much. But it is great hearing that happening on smaller places and smaller levels too, especially within your community as well. That's really beautiful. Now, earlier we were talking a little bit about power structures, because I know the book is a lot about power structures, and you speak in the book about how Jesus draws a line between himself and the powerful. This idea that Christ is always aligning himself with the marginalized and the vulnerable, So for folks that are trying to kind of wrap their head around all of this too, because some people may be more dialed in than others, but I want to talk about some macro and micro versions of power structures. So like for like in America overall, like what would you say would be some like macro? So what are some large power structures just for people to begin to understand and wrap their heads around this idea?
I mean, the foundational fiction upon which our country was created is race. And that is the structure of power that propels most of the economic and political systems that we work in now. But I think, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was I also wanted to make sure that we talked about the way that racial power is not separate from or distinct from these other large sort of macro systems of power that you're talking about, which I think are gender, sexuality, and class. If you start to pull on any one of those strings, eventually you're going to find that you've gotten to one of the other ones. They're interconnected, they work together, they facilitate one another's scaffolding as the structure of the United States.
Now, what about what are some power structures that we may see on more of a local level, on a communal, on a smaller level that like that we don't always pay as much attention to, because it's easy to talk about the big ones, but there's lots of small ones too.
Yeah. I mean, we witness that. We witness this sort of scaffolded structure, happening in our local communities all the time, in ways that I think in ways that certainly Black, queer women, Black queer communities have been gesturing us towards for decades, if not hundreds of years. And maybe just now, those of us in majority white communities are ready to hear, ready to listen and act. But policing would be one of the places where we see this sort of interwoven connection between protecting white property from things like vagrancy laws. Like, I don't know that you think like, oh, wow, have I really thought about what vagrancy laws are? It's criminalizing people who do not have a place to live. Yeah. And we don't have places to put them. We don't have mental health care for people who, it's not like there's another choice out there of where you can go. And so I think there are all of these things that we take for granted. Who gets onto your city council? What are the what kind of laws are there around zoning in your community? What's your relationship to developers? Who gets the tax increment grant in your community and who doesn't have access to that, right? All of these things are just reified forms of that, of racial capital at work in our local communities.
Now, much of the book, what I love what you're doing here is also you're continuing just to turn us back to the gospel and all of these things. Like, we continue to turn back to the gospel and all of this, because in so much of American Christianity, we've or at least in like conservative and evangelical circles, we've boiled down the gospel to something like, you pray a prayer, you know where you're going to go when you die, you're good. That kind of a very dumb, idiotic version of the gospel, which is not true. But you talk about this idea of the redemption, that the gospel is like redemption from cycles of violence is the heart of the gospel. Speak more to that. I love that line.
Yeah, I sort of had this, wanted to offer in the preface of this book, something that I hoped would set the stage for our understanding of kind of how I think about the relationship of the church in the world, that I think speaks to this question. And whereas I think the sort of Christianity that you're talking about, that I grew up in, that a lot of my church members grew up in and have left, comes from this sort of philosophical way of breaking up the world into things that are church things, like church worldview things, and then secular worldview things, right? And so, so really, the desire is to leave one and move to the other. Whereas I just was lucky enough to read theologians like Catherine Tanner, who taught me that we have a non-competitive relationship with all of these places where we can witness the gospel that we proclaim popping up in the world. It's not a contest to see who gets to lay claims to that. If we really do believe that that the Lamb of God was crucified at the foundation of the world, there is nothing outside of this redemptive act and work of God's good news that is rising up in the world. And so for me, like, abolition work has been such a profound example of where the gospel that refuses retribution, that is looking for people, looking for opportunities for second chances and third chances for people, that takes seriously the need for repair and transformation as part of justice, that all of that has come together. And so I don't think that I can understand my faith apart from the abolition communities that I'm a part of, because that's been realized. The gospel has been realized for me in those communities who make no claims to the church for the most part. And so I think that it's important to for us to move into this place of non-competition, that this is that the sense of the conservative church truly conserving, right? Like saying we have to sort of defend this piece, which is, of course, is its own fiction, right? All of this comes from somewhere. This is just more enlightenment, like whatever. That we have to just recognize that itself is something that was constructed. We are not. We have a decision to make for ourselves about whether we want to embrace that or not.
Well, one of my last questions here I have for you. I want to, like, what for you? How is Christ giving you hope in these polarizing times we're at right now? What is fueling you and giving you hope?
I am hopeful because I have learned, again, a lot from abolition community members, that a new world coming into being doesn't take place because the Supreme Court makes a decision about something, that we get this act passed. I think all of that is incredibly significant. I don't want to delegitimize how significant those things are for us. And we also know that in this white supremacy infested world, that this is going to reiterate itself over and over again. And so what we have instead are picking up these pieces of the kind of world that we want to live in, and drawing them together with others every single day. That cannot be taken from us. We cannot, no one can take away the practices of reconciliation and forgiveness and transformative justice that we are already working out among us. They can do anything they want. And we are already building the world that we want to see. We're doing it piece by piece, habit by habit, learning our history, refusing to be silent, showing up for one another, being in the streets together, getting our people out of jail, whatever it takes. Those are the pieces that's the thing that makes the world new. And that's ours. No one can take it away from us.
That's a lovely answer. Thank you so much for this. The book is How to Have an Enemy, Righteous Anger, and the Work of Peace by Melissa Florer-Bixler. It is out on July 20th. As I said before, it is a great read, and I challenge all of you guys out there to be able to read this. I think it's something that is necessary in this time. So, Melissa, thank you so much for your time.
It was great to be with you, Stuart. Thanks for having me on today.
Well, much thanks to Melissa Florer-Bixler. The book is fantastic, and what I wanted to do is give you guys just a little taste before I send you off today of the book. But there is another approach to others as enemies. In this way of calculating conflict, people who harm others are either misunderstood or simply acting out of their own self-interest to protect their thriving. The way to overcome our enemy is by creating spaces where the falsehood of being enemies is unmasked. We will discover that we all want the same things. We simply have different ways of reaching those goals. Once we are able to unite around this set of shared expectations, we can put down our more radical ideas and work towards a mutually agreed upon goal. Well, that's all I've got this hour, guys. The book is How to Have an Enemy by Melissa Florer-Bixler. The book is out July 20th. You should check it out. Well, as we end this broadcast, just a reminder, you can catch us on podcast, this show, and all past ones at www.snarkyfaith.com and wherever else you listen to podcasts. We're there. We're everywhere. So thank you again for being a part of the show week after week. I appreciate you all. And as I release you into the wild, wide world, I send you out with the holiest amount of grace and peace and snark. I'm out of here. Catch you guys next week. Peace.